Hi, welcome back, everybody. Sorry that we all got disconnected. It was a bit of a technical issue, but we are ready to resume, and we'll go ahead and get started with our PowerPoint. So just to recap, we are going to be focusing on women in the arts today and looking at a diverse group of women artists from the Alfond Collection of Contemporary Art here at the museum. So to get us started is one of my favorites from our collection. And I will say that about all four pieces, not because I'm a liar, but because it's true. We are very privileged to have many powerhouse artists in this collection, and the fact that they happen to be women is just a bonus. Um, so the work that we have here is called Where Do We Come From by Jaune Quick-To-See-Smith, and it is a mixed media on canvas work from 2001. This is a fairly new acquisition. We got it in 2018, and it has been a wonderful addition, providing us a springboard upon which to have a dialogue regarding visual post-colonial methodologies coming from Indigenous peoples. So a little bit about the artist. Jaune Quick-To-See-Smith is a French Cree, Shishon, and Salish heritage, and is an enrolled member of the Confederate Salish or Kootenai tribe of the Flathead Nation. In her work, Quick-To-See-Smith uses maps because they tell stories, and this is really important to her body of work. If you really spend time with a map, you find that they have many layers of narrative, not only about the land, so its physicality, but also when you get into the arena of geopolitics. But before we can unpack her work any further, it's important to understand that this map is not typical in the way that people understand the concepts of maps. Rather, it's a counter map. And so the practice of countermapping is a proactive post-colonial method of cartography that's meant to empower marginalized groups. So where official maps are blank, counter maps share information about generations of people, their customs, and disputes. So traditional maps have a history of being instructional devices, and you have within that category, a very fixed history, very fixed image, and within that, very fixed demarcation. But counter maps, they go against this normative formula of visual style and use that is traditional to maps. They don't follow any kind of uniform scale or serve a purpose outside detailing, Cartesian coordinates as you would see with a traditional map. Instead, it really tells us a little bit about cultural knowledge in regards to terrain, to area predators, good spots for shelter, and measures a lot more than just physical distance. It measures a psychological distance too. So it's in other words, like a map for qualitative experiences. That's a good way to put it. So returning to this work, Quick-To-See takes the essence of a counter map and turns it into a weapon within her artistic practice, which is heavily steeped in activism. She began this practice of using maps in her work around 1992, and that's a very important year because it marks the quincentennial or 500-year celebration of Columbus's landing in the Americas. So this was a response to that, or rather against it, as she sees that moment, 1492, when Columbus landed, as the nascent instant of when Western colonization kind of began. So typical of her work is also to use icons as images. So like a US map, as we have featured here, that icons being images that are instantly recognizable. But she adds a bit of a twist. So we see she has done that here as well, where instead of what we expect to see on a US map, we have instead a dripping canvas where the state borders have begun to bleed into one another. And there are no state names, as you can see, just 3 questions stacked across the map, which are: where do we come from? What are we? And where are we going? So this is meant to spark a reaction in the viewer, which I would love to test out if you will use the chat to kind of share with me what your initial thoughts and feelings were when you first saw this image, or as you look at it now and kind of have that initial experience. So I invite you guys to put that in the chat, and we can look at those in just a sec. So this twist that she adds to the map by removing the names, or by adding questions like we have here, or there's a couple other works that she has that only include state names that are indigenous names, or where she'll use color coding for the states in some way or another. But these twists work in 2 ways. On one level, they are a ploy to draw in the viewer, right? So you see something familiar, but it's off, and so you look deeper to explore why, right? And by doing so, you start thinking about what you understand as a map and why this is different, and that kind of begins a conversation where you are starting to question the established knowledge that you have regarding maps, or regarding what they mean, what they represent, how they work. But on another level, these twists are also a point of departure for examining the treatment of Native peoples in the Americas, or or rather just at the hands of Europeans, not just during colonial periods, but even now. Like, how has that history continued? So as viewers, and we're all living in the United States, which means our education system has brought us up in a very specific way, has taught us very specific things. But as viewers, we read these maps from, or rather this US map, from east to west, right? Because that's how we learned it. We subconsciously begin in New England, because that was the site of the 13 colonies, and work our way towards the west, right? The colonies subliminally representing to us the start of the US, right? Which is a very problematic and erroneous idea, but that's how we learn to read them. And so without realizing it, we are essentially complicit in feeding a system that is informed by a larger historic narrative based on the ideas and consequences of, like, manifest destiny. So the reading asserts a very specific point of view, which is that of Western expansion, right? Or if we wanted to play devil's advocate, is it really Western expansion, or is it Eastern invasion, right? Because East representing, in this case, Europe, not just because it is east of the United States, but if we read the map from east to west and what that means politically, you have Europe encroaching on the indigenous peoples that were already resided on that land. So Quick-To-See-Smith is presenting a map that speaks to the contested space of what we see as US soil, and the stolen lands and cultures that are connected to that space. The dripping paint supports these ideas, in that, in a sense, what they're doing is erasing the European presence, and we are understanding, or we are visually seeing the traces of Europe on this particular map as being represented by the land borders. Because in theory, the idea of borders is really arbitrary, right? It's the whole purpose there was to stake a claim, so it's constructed. And so on top of that, with these 3 questions, she's doing more than just create a moment of reflection for the viewer and where they are situated within this larger history. And that is that she is actually drawing on modern art and mid-20th century art history as inspiration, but then using that as the groundwork, asserting her own identity and that of her people within that larger history. So she has said repeatedly that she draws a lot of inspiration from the work of artists such as Jasper Johns, and we see that here. We see it in her larger body of work with her interest in collage, but here specifically his use of maps. So we see that for this, but then also her gestural work draws a lot of inspiration from the abstract expressionists. So it's connecting these across cultures and really making us question, it's not just Western art, it's art, it's the history of art, all art. And so other peoples that don't fall into that Western demographic are also part of that story. But additionally, she goes a little further than that. And the title here, where do we come from? And these questions actually come and connect her work from the title of a piece by the same name by the artist Paul Gauguin, from a work that he created in the 1890s. So French artist. So essentially, and this part is really interesting, what we have is two artists with two paintings by the same name that are dealing with different focuses, but at the core, they're doing the same thing. So with Gauguin's piece, which is, and I don't have it here in the presentation, I apologize, just because I couldn't find one that had a copyright title that I felt comfortable sharing. So that I wouldn't get myself into hot water, I just left it off, but do look it up. Same title as this work. But it's almost a chronological painting of a bunch of different indigenous peoples. And so what he's doing that is kind of focusing on this European grappling with indigenous claims and identity in Tahiti, which is where he spent a large part of his life. And then on the other side, you have Quick-To-See-Smith using this painting of the same title and focusing on the larger political commentary about the transformed landscape due to American expansion. So both on some level grappling with indigenous issues, but where these are connected is that they are both inserting their work into this larger artistic tradition. So for Jaune Quick-To-See-Smith, she's inserting her work as an indigenous Native American contemporary artist into the history of art. And with Paul Gauguin, he was a post-impressionist, and so part of that art movement was to step outside the norms of academic painting. And so his use of fresco and gold ground and very large scale paintings that connected it to these large history paintings, which were kind of the epitome of what the Academy considered fine art, is doing the same thing, kind of inserting himself into this history. So a very nice cross-cultural, cross-historical way of creating what we have here. So moving on to our second artist, and like I said, also a favorite of mine, especially the artist. I am obsessed with Sandra Ramos's work, but what we have here is Narcissus by Sandra Ramos, like I said, and it is an etching aquatint from 2012. So Sandra Ramos is a Cuban artist whose work is tied to her identity and experience as a Cuban, and this stretches across her entire body of work. So despite the fact that as of 2014, she lives in Miami, Florida, the majority of her artistic career up until this point took place on the island, beginning during the special period. And the special period was a time of very intense economic crisis from the early to mid 1990s. So I believe it started in 1989 and kind of ended in 1995, the brunt of which was 1990 to 1995. And this was due to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So when that happened, Cuba stopped receiving subsidies and political and military support. And this kind of, well, at the same time, the US imposed an embargo. So all of this led to incredible poverty and famine, and a really difficult time for everyone who still lived on the island. So as a result, these events prompted a lot of Cubans to leave and to move away. And for anyone who was left behind, they were faced with utter devastation. And so Ramos, who did stay behind, reflects that this period and living in Cuba at this period with the lack of basic necessities was foundational, really, in establishing the tone and the content of her work, which deals a lot with not just national issues and political issues connected to that, but with grief, loss, and isolation. So in Narcissus, what we see is a young girl serving as protagonist, and she is an ongoing motif in Ramos's work. It's a character she names Ariadne, and she's this small pioneer girl who is part self-portrait of Ramos, but also inspired by drawings of the lead character in Alice in Wonderland, so Alice. And in Ramos's work, the pioneer girl comes eventually to serve as a kind of emblem for the Cuban people. So here we have Ariadne leaning over this big blue surface that really kind of takes up half the canvas or half the print, and she looks to be staring into it, right? And so this, because of if you look here, this green, not green, well, kind of green, lighter form, tells us that this is likely a body of water. And we have, parallel to her physical form up here, this reflection looking back. So that kind of supports that narrative as a possibility. And we can draw some clues about the narrative that's happening here based on the work's title. So it's Narcissus, so to an extent we know that this girl is possibly in the process of either falling in love with her own reflection or making some kind of allusion to that story. And Ramos did, in fact, of course, there's a period of time in several of her works that connect to Greek mythology. And in this story particularly, we are basing this print on the story of Narcissus. So just as a micro recap, Narcissus is the son of the river god Cephissus and of a nymph as well. And he was just a very beautiful man. And so at one point, he rejects the amorous advances of a nymph named Echo, although in some earlier versions, it's actually of like a young man. But either way, he rejects this person, and this rejection angers the gods. And so out of vengeance, they make him fall in love with his own image. So he sits by the river and he stares at himself all day, but obviously this is a one-sided relationship that's going nowhere. So eventually he withers away and dies out of sitting there pining away. So whether it's starvation or thirst or, as you can imagine, any kind of natural cause of death that would come from sitting and staring at yourself, unmoving, not eating, not sleeping, possibly exhaustion. Or there are some versions where he kills himself out of grief. And then in the spot where he dies, regardless of the version that we're looking at, a white flower sprouts on the spot. And that flower, which is a real flower, it's called the narcissus. It's quite beautiful, it's white. And so that's the basics of that story. So Ramos' inclusion of Greek mythology really is serving as a reference to the past. So similar to what we saw with the Jaune Quick-To-See-Smith, she is tying Cuba's history to a more universal history, albeit it is a very Western history, because we're identifying the past as the Greek. That leaves out a couple stories, but this is borderline autobiographical, so this makes sense for her. Oftentimes, because of the particularities of the Cuban experience, and this is something she has shared, history and Cuba and its history and its politics and its people kind of get treated as a very singular case study, where because we don't have a lot of examples that are similar to very specific circumstances that have occurred on that island. And so she argues that in fact the essentialized issues that are faced in this country can and have occurred at any place in time in history. So they're really universal experiences because it's connected to human suffering. So it's all universal. And that response to being separated from the world is also seen in the treatment of the girl's body. So on this upper treatment, whose shape actually kind of resembles the island of Cuba. So this would be, Havana and Pinar del Rio would be down here. This would be the part with the mountains. And so really across Ramos's body of work, but not just her work, we also see this crop up in a lot of Cuban literature emerging during the second half of the 20th century. The island as a metaphor for isolation is a prolific theme. And it plays with the idea that water is everywhere and it serves as a barrier for the island's people. So Ramos herself references that same idea in an earlier work she has from 1983 titled La Maldita Circunstancia del Agua por Todas Partes, or in English it would be The Damned Circumstances of Water on All Sides. So she's definitely drawing into that earlier theme that was present in her work, and that is underlying, right? That grief and isolation that we discussed emerging from her time during the special period. But in addition to those layers of meaning tied to the Greek past and to the island, is the issue of modern associations we have with the figure of narcissists. So through the field of psychiatry and psychoanalysis, the term narcissism entered our vernacular, right? And it means someone who has a very enlarged ego or is, overly self-involved, just excessive unearned self-esteem. And all of that really just suggests a level of maturity. So interestingly, in Ovid's Metamorphosis, and that's a group of 15 books that detail all these Greek myths, in which coincidentally, I've been brushing up on it in preparation for one of our summer exhibitions. But in one of the books in Metamorphosis, it talks about in the story of Narcissus, his mother, previous to years before his death, having visited like an oracle and having been told that he was destined to, or rather that Narcissus was destined to have a very long life if he never recognized himself, which is quite cryptic. But when we take that idea, right, this promise of a long life, provided you don't give in to a narcissistic tendency, it helps to guide us towards the main message that Ramos has in this work. And it is a personal reflection that she speaks about, and it's her personal thoughts on the existence of a prevailing egocentrism and narcissism that is inherently a part of Cuban culture and politics, and as a consequence, tends to affect how it has and continues to develop as a country. Now, this is just a fun fact. I am Cuban, so I can say this, and I can attest to this fact. There is a bit of an ongoing joke in Cuban culture that is based on the idea that we Cubans can do everything better and we did everything first, right? The irony of this does not elude me, considering the state of the island for the past 61 years. But anyway, so this joke based on how amazing Cubans are is that Cubans are so clever that they even invented the dog, like the species, the dog. So it's kind of funny because technically the Havanese breed did originate in Cuba, so maybe they're onto something. But it definitely does emphasize the fact that there is an essence of narcissism in Cuban culture that is really interesting, and she does hone in on that, but she connects it to the island's political state in the past and in the present. So we have a lot of works by Ramos in our collection. I invite you to join us in looking at all of them anytime they're up, because her work is truly spectacular. But moving on to our third artist, we have the work called Renaissance Painting. That's the name, not the time period. The painting is called Renaissance painting, and it is by Keogh, and this is an acrylic painting from 2016. Now, Keogh is she is a U.S.-born artist. She was born in Alaska, actually, moved to the mainland early on, and she works primarily in painting and drawing. So much of her work has previously focused on very small paintings, so tabletop sized. But in the last few years, she's switched it up a bit into much larger scale works that approximate about 9 feet high, and she calls them mural paintings. And this one we see here is one of those paintings. This is like 84 inches tall. So in her work, she has really blurred the lines between what is considered fine art in the academic sense and the applied arts. So the applied arts is basically things that are aesthetically driven and incorporate design into everyday objects for consumer use, or really just for like product problem solving. So think in terms of like fashion design, industrial design, interior design. And historically, that has always taken a back seat to the fine arts and really didn't even gain much public attention until the popularity of the Art Nouveau movement and the arts and craft movement. And that would have been at the end of the 19th century. So her appreciation of art is heavily steeped in a love for design, right? And just kind of elevating that and blurring it with fine art. Her appreciation for that really kind of began simultaneous with art, because she started both painting, but also sewing and developing an interest in fabrics at the same time. So the result is a collection of work that is very detailed, and contains paintings of textile patterns and accessories, which pretty much plunge full stream into an exploration of the beauty of design and kind of getting lost in that process of making and of wearing clothing. And so this interest in fabrics and in interiors is reflected in her move towards these larger canvases as well, because she has suggested that they serve as backdrops rather than as art objects. So this once again collapses the lines between what is fine art, so the object as art, and the decorative function of art, because she's just kind of understanding them as a background to a lived experience, if you think of yourself as living with art. Now her process is really curious. It's very technical in its execution, and a likely result of her past experience as a technical illustrator. And she draws from techniques that were previously used in industrial sign painting. So she begins with a sketch, and then she enlarges it onto the canvas and fills it in with these flat color planes that you see in this work. I know there's no way of seeing it on the screen, but if you look really closely within that blue background, you see evidence of her underpaintings. So you'll see like pencil lines. Let that be a motivation for you to go see this in person. Like I said, it's very big, so if you look closely, you will see them. And I think it's funny that her work is described as darkly romantic, which is honestly the best description I can think of to explain the effect that her work has on viewers, definitely on me. They're very romantic and feminine, but they're also very unsettling. And this makes sense when you consider that she draws inspiration from the Surrealists and the Mannerists, so specifically Marguerite and Ingres. So if you start looking at their work in comparison to hers, it starts to create a bigger network of where you can see what she's drawing from. So in this painting, we have Keogh making kind of a commentary on the female anatomical form. She has several works that actually use this fragmented, headless woman's body as a subject, not necessarily with armor, although a lot of them do feature the organs that you see here. And the fragmented section It doesn't have to be a torso. Sometimes it's legs or breasts or hands, but a lot of body parts that are associated with femininity. And we continue down that train of thought about femininity. We see here she has highlighted the organs related to the female endocrine system. So we've got the thyroid up here, we've got the pancreas, got kidneys, and we have breasts. And they're not, especially the breast, it's really painted as we would see it from the inside, right? So it's not a fetishized or a sexualized view of breast. It's anatomical. And all of these are superimposed on this suit of armor. And this raises questions regarding how much protection the organs are actually receiving, right? We're worn on the outside, not just outside the armor, outside the body altogether, right? Problematic. But this helps to categorize the work within an additional discourse that we see often in Keogh's work, with her engaging in the dialogue dealing with violence against women's bodies. So lots to unpack in her work, a beautiful collection that I do encourage you to continue to look into. And our fourth and final piece for the evening, again, one of my favorites, I wasn't kidding, is this work titled Louvre by Carrie Mae Weems, and it is a photograph from 2006. And I thought it would be a really fitting conclusion to our conversation because as a museum, we have a civic responsibility, not just to our cities and to our countries, but this, I apologize if this sounds a little overly idealistic, but really to the history of humankind and to all the stories and cultures that are involved in time and that have left behind objects and artifacts for us to share. You know, it should not be a one-sided story. And that's a conversation that Weems begins here. So this work is part of a larger series that she began in the same year, 2006, and that is called the Museum Series. And it discusses the gendered, racial, socioeconomic, social-political problems of collection and exhibition practices in museums. So this series responds to the overarching themes that Weems consistently tackles regarding inequality in terms of class systems, social, cultural, and socioeconomic relations, gendered experiences, as I mentioned, and the complexities of identity as a whole. All of these thematic avenues serve as entry points through which to unpack a larger conversation on the Black experience in a much more nuanced way, but also on a, really not just of the Black experience, it could be extended to a universal experience. If one aligns the results, if you reflect on these emerging themes in her work, it really does engage all facets of humanity that it is experiencing inequity of any sort. So it does expand. In this photograph specifically, we have Weems right here, and this is actually the artist, and she is standing with her back to the viewer, shrouded in this Black dress, which really serves to ground the form and really call the viewer's attention, but also it's her, the choice for it to be a black garment just wasn't so that it would show up dark on the black and white photograph, but it's that color is symbolic, right? That's her dressed in the Black experience, right? And she is facing the Louvre Pyramid here, which is a symbol of well, not just the institution, but really has become one of the main symbols of Paris since it was completed in 1989. And she just confronts this, 70 some odd foot structure. And the conversation that this position begins relates to her intersectionality as a female and as a Black artist, and asks the viewer to place her within the operations of the institution, as well as the historic narratives that are accepted and propagated within and through its practices. Her corporal presence really factors heavily into how effective this photograph is, and stems from her awareness of the space that a body can take up and how it can be used, that she developed during her years in theater. And in a sense, this work, if you consider that, it becomes more than a photograph, in that it becomes a kind of performance where Weems, as herself, as artist, kind of ceases to exist and becomes enveloped into a larger collective of people historically excluded from cultural institutions such as the Louvre, whether it's as visitors or as represented artists, staff even, or board members. And it kind of kickstarts a call to action to be better and more exclusive and transparent. So this series also includes photographs that place Weems, so not this image, but obviously, but the series places her in dialogue with a bunch of other museums, including the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Project Row House in Houston, Tate Modern in London, and the Galleria Nazionale Moderna in Rome. There's more, but those are just some of the ones that are part of it. And so with that, I'm opening the floor up for any questions or comments that you might have about the works that we have seen tonight. All questions are welcome. All right. Well, if there are no questions or comments, I will interpret that as that I have sufficiently satisfied every curiosity you might have had. Okay. Good. I'm glad to hear. See, I was channeling Dana's comment there. We have one coming in. Are there any other contemporary women's artists that are not in the collection that you like? Oh, so many. There is one on my mind, which I will share right now, because I'm such a fan of her work, and that is Wendy Red Star. She is a contemporary Native American artist, and then she factors not just the post-colonial ideas, but also feminism, and her work is beautiful. It's really fun as well. She works with her daughter a lot, and they create really quirky photographs, but that on the surface they seem superficial, but the play, the intricacy of them when you really start to unpack them is, I mean, you can spend a day examining one. That might be an exaggeration, but slight exaggeration, really. But I hope that someday soon we can incorporate her in. And there are so many other women that I couldn't add for the sake of time, but that are in our collection that I would highly recommend you all going to see. But let's see. So if there's no more questions, and because I have pretty much finished my drink, I think that means it's time for me to stop talking for the evening. So as we conclude, I do want to just thank you for joining me, and I hope that you will do so again next month, which will be on Wednesday, April 7th. But in the meantime, do join us later this month on Tuesday, March 23rd for an artist talk with Ronnie Matar, who's just a fabulous artist, and her photographs are currently on view at the Cornell Fine Arts Museum right now as part of the exhibition on either side of the window, Portraits During COVID-19. It's a really impressive, reflective, and relatable body of work. But until then, thanks again, and if you are drinking, don't drive, very important, and I will see you all next time. Have a good night.